Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Classical Republican. Today we're going to be doing a book review on Fears of a Setting Sun, The Disillusionment of America's Founders by Dennis C. Rasmussen. So here, you have to look at the graphic right there. That is what was on a chair in the Constitutional Convention, and Benjamin Franklin made a comment about whether that was a rising sun or a setting sun. And so he was pondering upon that during the whole convention, and then he made that comment when they're signing it, and he says, I think it's gonna be rising. So let's go on with one thing I want to say about this book is that it's very clearly written and very well organized. So it's a very fast read, even though it's 232 pages. I'm a very slow reader, and I read it in a couple days, though this is Thanksgiving break. I'm still a very slow reader. So yeah, this is the way I tell my students to write, to be well organized, to say what you're going to, what your main point is, then go into detail about it. And so that's something that all writers can learn, so they can be better writers. So first we have the thesis is all founding fathers grew disillusioned, except Madison. And I'd like to point out that he's one of the most classically Republican of all the founding fathers. George Washington should also be considered probably the next most closely classically Republican. But he was more pragmatic, so he never dealt in any theory, always with practice. So he didn't have any. He didn't leave any very classically Republican theory that we can really. But in his farewell address, he does leave. He drops two big classically Republican worries, and those two are avoiding faction, which is what Venice was all about. Venice, their whole system was, the Venetian ballot was all about avoiding faction. So that's something, because during his administration, you had the Federalists and you had the Democratic Republicans start to form into factions, and they were. He didn't like that. He really didn't like that. He thought it was going to tear the country apart. Then also, he thought that he worried about domination by foreign powers. So this is also connected to faction, because the Federalists were very pro-British. You see that in the Adams administration. And then you see that the Democratic Republicans were very pro-French. And you see that in the Jefferson administration. So let's get on with the book. So he has an introduction, then he goes into a few chapters on Washington, Hamilton, Adams, Jefferson, and then the rest. And then the last few chapters are on Madison. So Washington had all these worries about, what I just spoke about was the entangling alliances, and faction. And also privately, he did talk about slavery. He was really worried about slavery, but never discussed it in public. And of course, he was right. Slavery did cause a big kerfuffle later in our history. Hamilton, he was worried about democracy, the spirit of populism. Then he was also worried about the state governments, that they would weaken the national government. Adams, also afraid of democracy, and the lack of virtue. And he felt if you can't have virtue, then you can't have if you don't have public spirited virtue, then you can't have Republican government. let's see, he was well, one thing that I thought was interesting that was also very classically Republican that was mentioned here was that he was for government-supported education, compulsory militia service. He was for sumptuary laws, okay, so luxury taxes, and laws to ward off vices, so sin taxes. Also, those are classically Republican. He worried about the state government's rivalry with the federal government, and he worried about partisanship, even though he engaged in it himself. He worried that private and party interests would prevail over the national interests. Then we go to Jefferson, who's he's more of a liberal anyway, classical liberal. So that's why, as the main author of the Declaration of Independence, it draws more heavily from liberal ideology, Hobbes and Locke. But Jefferson, and this is what I tell my students, is that you can't put him in a box. He won't stay in there nicely. You can always find something that takes him out of the box, like on every subject. It's so difficult. So Jefferson, but then again, he can also be, on a few issues, he was very classically Republican. So it's weird. So he's got division between North and South over slavery and increasing centralization of the federal government. So then they go on. I'll just read the list of people that he only spends a few paragraphs on each of them. George Mason, Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, Eldridge Gerry, Tom Paine, Benjamin Rush, Gouverneur Morris, John Jay, James Monroe, and John Marshall. All at some point had some grave worries about where we were going as a country, and that it would not last. And that's an interesting thing because every founding father at some point says, this isn't going to last beyond a generation. Our generation, meaning their generation. So let's get to Madison. Here's a quote here. He says, quote, "confident in the superiority and durability of the American Republic." And this was late in his life. He did have some worries. His greatest concern was the nullification crisis in the early 1830s. So, which is really ironic because where did the nullifiers get the intellectual foundation for their argument? From Madison. And a little bit from Jefferson, but with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions during the Adams administration, which are still, I don't know, some would argue is not really a closed book, because they didn't really enact anything. They were just resolutions from state legislature. So the South Carolina nullifiers were drawing from the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And without those, there would never really have been a nullification crisis. So, in 1834, Madison states that the constitutional order had proven successful beyond any of the forms of governments, ancient or modern. Okay, that's a reference to the classical republicanism of the Constitution. So here's the why. To the author, this is the why. He was even-tempered, had lower standards than the other founding fathers at what they had created. He had lived long enough to see the U.S. weather storms. So, and the author points out that we still have all these problems to this day, 2 centuries later. So my take as a classical Republican is that because he was the most classically Republican of the founders, he understood the best how the system that he had helped set up in theory should be long-lasting and stable to a certain extent, like Aristotle had laid out with the mixed regime. And so here we are, 2 centuries later, seeing how it plays out in practice. All right. So please like, subscribe, and share so we can spread the message of classical republicanism to oppose arbitrary domination and uphold the mixed regime. Long live the Republic.